Every crime leaves something behind. In this one, it was a set of footprints that led to the farm through fresh snow and never led away. Bavaria. The 31st of March, 1922. A cold and stormy night in a corner of Germany that had not yet learned to fear what was already inside its walls. 6 people would be dead by morning, and the man who killed them would stay for 3 more days. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck, and it was not even an official place on the map. It was a long Bavarian farmhouse joined to its barn under one continuous roof, set on open ground ringed by dense woodland, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. The nearest neighbor was a 10-minute walk through the forest. 6 people lived there. Andreas Gruber, 63, was the patriarch, a hard man by every account, authoritarian and reclusive. Years earlier, he had been convicted of incest with his own daughter. His wife Kazilia was 72. Their widowed daughter Victoria, 35, was known in the village as the Lark of Hinterkaifeck for her voice in the church choir. She had 2 children, Kazilia, 7 years old and in her 2nd year of school, and Joseph, 2, who slept in a pram in the bedroom. And then there was the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44, who had arrived only that afternoon. In the weeks before the murders, Andreas Gruber had begun telling people that something was wrong at the farm. He told a neighbor and a shopkeeper and a man in the ironmongers in Schrobenhausen that he had been hearing footsteps in the attic at night and that a house key had gone missing. A Munich newspaper had appeared on the property, one no one in the family subscribed to and one the postman swore he had never delivered. The previous maid had quit months earlier, saying the house was haunted. And on the day before he died, Andreas Gruber found footprints in fresh snow that came out of the woods and led to the machine shed, with no trace of anyone leaving. He told the ironmonger what he had seen. He had heard something in the attic all night, as if someone were walking around up there. He went up with a light and found nothing, but in the morning, there were fresh tracks in the snow leading to the house, none leading away. Footprints went in, none came out. Someone had walked toward the farm. No one had walked back. A neighbor offered him a gun, and Andreas said his own rifle was ready. He never called the police. The next evening, between roughly 8 and 10 o'clock, the killings began. The court physician later narrowed the window from what the victims were wearing. Andreas was in his nightshirt, the 7-year-old was in hers, and Victoria and her mother were still in day clothes. Investigators later pieced together what most likely happened. The killer was waiting in the barn. The cattle had been let loose. One by one, the adults came out to settle the animals, and one by one they were struck down with a Ruithaua, a heavy farm mattock that Andreas himself had modified years earlier. Old Cecilia fell on the threshold of the barn door. Victoria fell across her mother. The 7-year-old was struck too, but she did not die. She lay in the hay for hours, conscious enough to tear out clumps of her own hair. When the killing in the barn was done, the man walked through the feeding passage into the house. He found the new maid asleep in her chamber and killed her in her bed. He found the 2-year-old in his pram and brought the weapon down so hard it went through the canopy and into the child. Then he covered them. Hay over the 4 in the barn with a wooden door laid on top. A duvet over the maid. The child's pram was covered with his mother's red skirt. And then he stayed. For the next 3 days, smoke rose from the chimney at Hinterkaifeck. A passerby named Michael Puckel noticed it. In the morning, the oven door was closed, and by evening it was half open. He saw a lantern moving in the woods. A farmer traveling near Brunnen at 3 in the morning on the 1st of April said he saw 2 figures at the edge of the forest, and they turned away when they noticed him. Coffee salesman knocked on the 1st of April. No one answered. The postman delivered the paper on the 3rd, and the cattle were restless but not starved. Someone was feeding them. On the afternoon of the 4th of April, the family failed again to appear in town. A neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, walked over with 2 other men. They went in through the machine room and found 4 bodies stacked under hay in the barn. Schlittenbauer pushed into the house alone and found the maid and the child. By the time the Munich police arrived, more than 7 hours had passed. Dozens of curious villagers had walked through the property, and the tracking dog could no longer pick up a scent. Investigators climbed into the attic above the machine room, and what they found there is, in many ways, the most haunting evidence in the case. There were hollows pressed into the straw, the shape and size of a man. A finger-thick rope, knotted at the top, hung down into the room below. 2 roof tiles had been pushed aside just enough to give a clear view of the entire farmyard. Someone had been living up there, watching them, perhaps for weeks. A year later, when the farm was being torn down, workers found the murder weapon. It had been hidden in a concealed compartment above the staircase, a Fehlboden, a hidden gap between the floor and the ceiling below it. Only someone who knew the building's construction would have known it was there. It was the Reuthau, stained with blood, and it was the one Andreas Gruber had modified himself. Over a century, more than 100 suspects have been investigated, and the case has settled around a few real possibilities. The first is Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who found the bodies. He had once been Victoria's lover, and he was the acknowledged legal father of the 2-year-old Josef. The paternity fight over the boy had soured into open hatred between Schlittenbauer and Andreas. He led the way into the farm, and he moved the bodies. Years later, standing at the demolished site, he reportedly said that the killer had tried to bury the victims, but the ground had been frozen, a detail some investigators came to call guilty knowledge. But the police of the day cleared him. And later, when a detective named Konrad Müller-Thumann kept naming him as the killer in public, a German court ordered the detective to stop. The second theory points at Andreas Gruber himself. The Reuthauer was his. The hiding place was inside his house. The 7-year-old's wounds did not quite match the weapon, which suggests she may have been hit incidentally by someone else swinging it badly. Some researchers argue that Andreas killed his family and then died in the chaos. The theory has one obvious problem. It doesn't explain who fed the animals and ate the food for 3 days afterward, unless he lingered long enough to do it himself. Police never seriously considered him, because he was a victim. The third theory is the drifter. An escaped psychiatric patient named Joseph Bertel was placed on a wanted list in 1926 and never found. But the modern analysts who have reviewed the case reject this theory. Too much gold and silver was left untouched in the house. The killer covered the bodies. He fed the cows. He stayed. The most rigorous recent review came in 2007. 15 students at the police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck examined the surviving file as a graduation project, and they concluded the case could no longer be legally solved. The skulls of the victims were lost in the Second World War. The murder weapon was destroyed when Augsburg was bombed in 1944. The farm itself was torn down a year after the killings. But working independently, several of the student groups arrived at the same suspect. They chose not to publish the name out of respect for living descendants. The case was formally closed in 1955, and the last interrogation was conducted in 1986. No DNA work has ever been done. All that survives are paper records and 5 photographs, and none of it can be tested. The 6 victims lie buried in Weidhofen Cemetery without their skulls. Where the farm once stood, there is now only farmland and a small concrete shrine called the Hinterkaifeck Andachtsstätte. Locals will tell you the place still feels heavy. A set of footprints leading to the farm through fresh snow, and no footprints leading away. The simplest reading of the case is the one Andreas Gruber could not act on. Whoever killed his family was already inside the house when he stood in the snow that morning, looking down at the tracks. The killer had been there for some time. He had been watching them. And on the cold and stormy night of the 31st of March, 1922, he came down from the attic and did what he had come to do. And then he stayed. 3 more days in the kitchen, eating their food, feeding their cows. We do not know who he was. We only know he never left the way strangers leave in stories, on foot, through the snow. There were no tracks leading away from the farm because he was still inside. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.